of the best estates that this country has on offer. Well, it's Monday and we're talking all things property, and this evening we're looking at legal matters. Far too often, a lot of us tend to struggle when it comes to legal matters, when it comes to a lot of our property transactions, whether you're buying a freestanding house, a sectional title, or of course buying into a development. And this evening we're looking at here's why developers need conveyancers. We're going to be looking at the important role that conveyancers play when we're buying, especially into new developments or even established developments, but particularly new developments, because I'm sure some people, we tend to see a lot of these placards and you get excited, but you're not quite sure about how exactly things work with the various stakeholders. And we're also going to be taking some of your questions and comments throughout the show, as we usually do, whether you're watching us on Facebook, on Twitter, on YouTube, or on Instagram. Welcome, and of course, send through those questions and comments, especially when it comes to legal matters and the role that conveyancers play in our property transactions, and help us better understand what this role of conveyancers are, especially when it comes to developers. I'm joined this evening by Esri Marais, who's a partner at Marais Pacitti Attorneys. Good evening, Esri, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Zama. It's so nice to be here again. Thank you.
It's only a pleasure. It's always great having you with us, Esri. I think before we even just go too far, maybe a quick explainer what exactly conveyancers do and the important role that they, typically play in our property journey.
Zama, I don't think we've got enough time to explain everything that we do, but especially in developments, it's something very close to my heart and something very exciting that I like to share with everyone in my life. It's the reason why it's such an interesting part of the law for me, specifically the property law, is that you deal with a lot of other role players and stakeholders in the business. So we deal with town planners, with surveyors, with architects, with builders, and all these people, even council, which is quite an exciting place to be. Also, just that it's not just a property transaction of transferring a property from A to B. It's basically starting the process from scratch, where the developer comes to you and says they're looking at a property, they want to buy the property, and this is the proposed development that they intend developing the property with. So for us, or for me particularly, that's where I find it interesting to be able to deal with all these different people in the process. And yeah, so we can go through the entire process. I don't know if that's where you want me to start.
I think let's probably just look at broadly what the process is, because I don't want us to get too hectically into the nitty-gritties. Because one of the things that I want to also find out, especially because we have a growing number of viewers at home who have an interest in being developers themselves, some of them, almost developing at a smaller scale, so nothing compared to some of what the big developers are currently developing right now. So I'm also interested, to get a sense of whether people who are developing at very small scale would also be using the services of conveyancers for their small developments.
Yes, so it's quite interesting because we only use, so unless you have a developer client that's close to you that you work with very often, we only get involved at a later stage, if I can put it that way. So the client will source for the property or that they want to buy, or the farm that they want to buy, that they want to develop. That obviously, that process takes quite a long time. Then they enter into discussions with engineers, architects, and all of those role players. And that process also takes a very long time. But where we get involved is that they approach us to do what we call a conveyancer certificate. So the moment that they're interested in buying the property, before they do the proposed development and application to the city or to the municipality, they have to know that there aren't any restrictive conditions on the property. So that's where the conveyancer certificate comes in. They will hand me the title deed of the property, and I'll have to physically go through every single title deed condition. And depending on how those conditions were created in the title, there's a way in which you can either remove it, or a way in which it doesn't really have to be removed. It will be sufficient for the proposed development that you're doing. So obviously it depends on what development you want to do. If you want to subdivide and it's prohibited in terms of your title, then I'll pick that up. So I will then go back to the client or to the developer and say to them, what you are proposing to do can or can't happen. If it can happen, then they proceed with the application to the municipality. If it can't happen, I will have to explain to them how they need to get rid of those conditions, whether it is to just apply to the municipality to have it cancelled, whether it is to cancel it in the deeds office, or whether it is to make application to court in order to remove those conditions in order to proceed with that development. And then after that's done, they can proceed to apply to the municipality to have the subdivision and the development approved. And usually, especially in terms of the SPLUMA Act, you have 5 years in which you have to do that. If you don't develop the property within that 5 years, then it will lapse. So you get your consent for that. The development starts. You get your surveyor to do the measurements on the property. Obviously, you have your architect to design the entire building, or whether it is an entire development or a township or whatever it is. And you then, that's when they come back to us, when those diagrams are approved by the Surveyor General. We then take those diagrams and we apply to the deeds registry to open the scheme. That's when it's a sectional title. We then open the scheme, we register it, we draft your, so that's also when conveyancer comes in to draft your management and conduct rules, which is required in terms of the law for sectional titles. If you've got a homeowners association, we draft your constitution for you. And then obviously if you've got all other role players involved already, so like your agents, where we've drafted your sale agreements for you, we then transfer the properties into the new owners or the third parties' names. And also if your development is in phases, the developer has to register a real right to extend that initial development. So if phase 1 will happen now, phase 2, obviously, because all developers don't have money in the beginning, they use the first phase to budget for the second phase, and that's how the development continues. And in order to do that, you have to actually register a real right to extend. There's obviously a lot of terms and conditions attached to that. So you have to, especially in the deeds office, you have to actually register how those phases will look in the future. So they're very strict rules in terms of how that's done. And then everything is registered. In a perfect world, that's quickly and that's fantastic. But with the development, unfortunately, things don't happen that quickly. So, depending on how the extent of the development, it might be 6 months, it might be 20, 30 years.
And unfortunately, one of the things that we're realizing is that sometimes things also don't move that quickly at the deeds office, unfortunately. So that also can be quite a painful process. Esri, from my own curiosity, one thing that you mentioned that I've actually been very curious about, you're mentioning how sometimes a developer will get a piece of land, they'll purchase it, and part of what a conveyancer would do is you would look if there are any restrictive conditions on the title deed. What kind of conditions would there typically be, in a title deed that would perhaps, make it difficult for them to go to the next stage, or where the conveyancer would obviously have to come in and either make sure that it's done away with, or even go to the court?
Yeah, so the most restrictive conditions that I've had in my career with regards to developers that want to develop is firstly the restriction on subdivision, which is obviously a very huge problem for them. And the second thing is also where it restricts you on having more than one dwelling on the property. So I'm sitting with a development at the moment where they want to develop 4 units, but they're only allowed 2. So that's quite problematic for the developer. And again, it really depends on how those conditions were created. If it was created pre-1934, there's a specific way how you deal with it. If it was created by the developer at that point in time when the developer develop the land, then if the developer exists, there's an easy way to do it. If they don't exist, then it's a bit more difficult. So it really depends on how those conditions were created. But that's usually the restriction on subdivision is a big problem. And then also if Act 70 of 70, which is subdivision of agricultural land, if that comes into play, that's a huge problem because you can't subdivide agricultural land. And if that's the case, then you have to apply to the municipality to either state that it's not agricultural land anymore, if that is the case, and if it is, then you've got a big problem on your hands.
And I think one of the big things, and I'm sure it will probably be something that's covered in the farming podcast, when you kind of look at look at agricultural land, look at the conditions over agricultural land. Of course, we have the farming podcast that is brought to you by Mbali every Tuesday and Thursdays at 1:00. So if you have any interest in farming, whether it's just curiosity or something you're very seriously considering doing, that's certainly a podcast for you to tune into, where you'll be learning all things relating to farming, whether small scale farming or even big scale farming. I think some of the really incredible guests that she's had, some of them very young in their 20s, and who are getting their foot into farming and learning quite a lot about the farming value chain, and also understanding where exactly in the farming space you very likely want to find yourself into. I am, of course, in conversation with Esri Marais, who's a partner at Marais Pacitti Attorneys, and we're looking at the ways in which, the role rather that conveyancers play when it comes to developments. And I think one of the big things, Esri, and it's something that I want us to touch on just after this break, is oftentimes there's obviously this big role that you're playing with the developer, whether it's relatively in the early stages of the development, and then later on, after everything has been built and all the admin has been sorted. And then, of course, comes the stage where you're now dealing with the actual end users, so the customers who are actually, buying into the development, and the role then that conveyancers also play in that regard. I want us to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to be looking at that. I've seen some of the questions and comments coming through from Facebook, from some of our viewers at home. We'll be going through them quite shortly. And of course, do keep them coming. If you've ever had an issue when it comes to the conveyancing process during your property transaction, do share that with us. I've often shared my own, faux pas when it comes to attorneys, in the property ownership space. And maybe I'll share a little bit about that, because I saw one of the questions actually touches on this one. But we're going to go for a quick break, and we'll be back just after this. Property podcast. I'm your host, Zama. I'm in conversation with Esri Marais, who's a partner at Marais Pacitti Attorneys, and we're looking at here's why developers need conveyancers. Really, the role that conveyancers play when it comes to developments. And I think the first half of our conversation has looked at probably the side that we don't explore quite a lot, which is all the behind the scenes activity that a lot of us at home tend to not be exposed to, because oftentimes by the time we're interested in a development, they are already signs up, they've either just about to break ground or they've already broken ground. So if you find out about a development early enough, they're already advertising it and they haven't quite broken ground, and they're signing as many people on so that they're also able to reach their target, because they have various targets, as Esri was saying, that oftentimes, development is it's a numbers game. So you have to have a certain percentage during the various phases and as you move along. We are taking your questions and comments at home when it comes to your experience with dealing with conveyances, especially on your property journey, because this is something that we're not going to avoid. Whichever way you look at it, you're always going to need the services of a conveyancer as long as you are buying or selling this immovable asset. We've got a question here coming from Facebook, which is from Andrika Lechanyane, who says, a client and her neighbors want to convert their freestanding property into a sectional title scheme. Now, traffic won't be affected as there's no land, as no land has been reserved by the municipality for future development or road reserves. Their properties are situated in a cul-de-sac. Would this be possible? What would the process entail?
Yeah, so the process is exactly the same as I explained earlier. You'd have to get a town planner involved in order to make the application to your municipality, to council, to find out whether they are happy with the proposed development. Again, one of the documents that they need in order to apply to council is the title deed of the property. So the title deed of the property will tell you whether there are any servitudes registered over the property, which is it might be in favor of the neighbors, which means that it won't be possible, or that you require the consent of the neighbors. So really depending on the exact development and the proposed development that they want to see happen, that is going to be what you apply to the municipality for the subdivision or for the development. But I'd suggest the town planner gets involved. You have to look at the title deed, and that's where the process really will take off. And then after that, you'll have to get your architects involved to after you've received the actual approval. When you get the approval from council, it's quite interesting because council then provides you with conditions to the approval. So they always, if they do give you approval, they give you conditions to that, which will be that you have to have a servitude in favor of your neighbor, that they can use that road, that you never restrict that road, that there will be a body corporate that will come into existence that needs to make sure that the sewage is dealt with, that the electricity is dealt with, and all sorts of lovely things that they want you to be able to comply with. So that's really where your process will start, is to make application to council to find out if you can do that, and then also to look at your title deed to see if there are any restrictions to doing that.
We've got another question here from one of the top fan gang members on Facebook, Umatha Shingang, who says, who decides on the attorney to appoint for conveyancing between the buyer and the seller?
So the general rule, and Zama, you know this, the general rule is that the seller appoints the conveyancer in the process. However, really the reason for that is that the seller wants to have control over the process and wants to make sure that everything happens smoothly. The problem with that is that the purchaser pays for the conveyancer's fees. So I know that purchasers, every single time I deal with a transfer, that's always an issue for the purchasers. But the parties can decide to use the purchaser's conveyancer. It's really just by agreement that they can decide that. However, the general rule is that the seller's attorneys will be the conveyancers in the matter.
And I think, if anything, a pro tip with this one, especially the moment you start, very actively investing in property. So let's say you're not buying your primary residence, you're now buying a few of your rental properties. You end up having, the conveyancers that you typically enjoy working with and that you have a relationship with. Sometimes they give you discounted rates. What you're able to do is one of the clauses that you put in the offer to purchase is that you choose your own attorney for the transfer. And by the time the seller sees that, they can decide whether they agree or don't agree. So it is really a conversation that can be had. I've certainly had instances where I've appointed my own attorneys because it's people that I've now been working with on a few transactions, and it just works out better. But of course, if the seller insists, they are well within sort of their realm
Their
of
rights.
insisting, of insisting that it should be the case. And I think I think one of the big things was sometimes, especially when you're doing it for the first time, a part of you thinks, what if the attorneys are scammers? Because of course, if you have, for example, a deposit, that money is going to be going into that trust account, then just look them up. Excuse me, I think if you look them up, and you can even, check if they're accredited with the Law Society. So there are ways that you can double check that they are in fact who they say they are. And as opposed to just thinking I'm being scammed, and they say they're attorneys, but they're not necessarily attorneys.
But can I maybe just jump in here for 1 second and just say that I think what a lot of people don't understand is that, this was literally actually in case law a few years ago, that conveyancers, when doing a transfer, even if they're appointed by the seller, they have to act in the best interest of both parties, the purchaser and the seller. So I think that's really something that prospective purchasers need to understand, is that whenever I do a transfer, everyone needs to be on the same level, treated the same. All the information must be given to everyone at the same time, same manner.
And I think it is one of those things that, unfortunately, when you're doing it for the first time, you're probably just skeptical, because you're thinking, how can it be that, we are both being, our needs are both being catered for equally? But as you're saying, that is the case. And you're going to find that communication is everybody's copying the email when they ask certain questions, when they update you at the end of the week in terms of where the transaction is, everybody's copied. It's clear where the snags are in the transaction. So things like that, you'll be able to, I think they certainly give you peace of mind that, oh, okay, so they're actually looking out for both our interests. If there's anything that they need to privately follow up with the one party, they'll ask you about it, offline. And then once it's resolved, they'll come back to sort of the group email. So I think understanding that they really do service both sides is such an important one. Of course, we're still continuing taking your questions and comments when it comes to the role that conveyancers play, especially into developments. We've got somebody asking here, it was Uqiniso Mbese, who asked on Facebook, can we buy in cash? And I think I want to rephrase his question with the role then that conveyancers play when a property is being bought in cash, because I think sometimes perhaps people might think it's only for when properties are being bonded. Perhaps explain to us that difference, Esri.
No, so I mean, cash is king, and I think any developer will. That's the perfect purchaser, is to pay in cash. The reason for that, besides the fact that it's just already available at the point where you need it, but the fact of the matter is that if you pay in cash, you don't have to wait, so your process doesn't take that long. So, obviously the development might still be in process, which you still have to wait for. But if you've got a bond involved, you've got a bond attorney involved, and there probably also might be a bond cancellation that has to take place. So especially if we're talking about developments, most developers I know will definitely start their development by having a development bond in place. So the time that you go to register, to open the scheme firstly, and to register the second bond or the first bond on the property of that's going to the new purchaser, you'll have to so you're sitting with 3 attorneys in place. So you've got your bond cancellation attorney, you've got your bond attorney who's going to register your purchaser's bond, and you've got me, the conveyancer, doing the transfer. So that entire process, it just takes much longer to get to a point where you can actually transfer the property, because you have another role player involved in the process. So paying cash is no problem. In fact, it's a plus point for the developer. If you're talking about physically coming to my office and paying in cash, there are other rules involved in that, and I actually need to then to go and take and apply, and to go and apply my mind to that, because that's obviously something you need to take heed of, especially us attorneys. We can't just take cash. But if it's literally that on the day that we request that you pay the funds or the purchase price into our trust account, that's an absolute fantastic scenario for the developer.
Mm-hmm. And another question here, this one is, can one negotiate the rates? Those costs are killer. I mean, oftentimes, Esri, every time we talk about attorney fees, I get chest pains. I think sometimes, I think I once even tweeted that I probably need to start a stokvel where we are putting money aside just for transfer fees alone. So whether it's bond registration and the transferring attorneys, but there has to be some kind of stokvel that we all just put our monies towards, because it can be quite a big amount, of course, depending on the, the purchase price of the property.
Zama, you've got the wrong conveyancers in place. No, you can try. I think so. Usually what happens in our conveyancing process in developments is that two things can happen. The developer can decide that in the purchase price, they include the conveyancing fees, the actual transfer fees, so as to make it a bit less expensive for the purchaser, so that the purchaser thinks that it's an all-inclusive fee that they're paying. So that might be the case. But if it's not the case and you have to pay the conveyancer's transfer fees, my first port of call would be to say, and obviously not if it's me, I wouldn't want that, but if you are purchasing, and especially if it's your first time, I would say every single time ask for a discount. It's not that you're going to necessarily be allocated it, but you can always ask for it. But again, usually in the developments, it's already a fee that is set. And it's going to be really difficult for the conveyancer at that point in time to give you a discount, because it's all set and it all comes in at a specific point where it then needs to pay for something else again. So it's all very regulated from day one. But it's always worth asking for a discount.
Esri, one of the questions that's come up, and you've answered it, but I like that the viewer asked it slightly differently, which for me raises the question of whether we perhaps think it's different when we're buying through a private seller, whether we're buying through a developer. And this question is coming through from Ukatleho Sikobo, who's asking, when buying through a private seller, who's responsible for the lawyer's fees? So this one, they're asking specifically when you're buying through a private seller, because I think maybe the perception might be that if you're buying through, if you're buying a development, then it's slightly different. Perhaps demystify that one for us.
Yeah, so it's not different at all. What could be different is that developer will appoint their conveyancer from the outset of the development, usually. So they'll say, we are going to instruct, and you'll see in the sale agreements, they'll have the conveyancer listed as Marais Pacitti attorneys. So you can't do much about that. And that means that the purchaser is, if the seller doesn't include that, or the developer doesn't include that in your fees, then you are in for the purchase price or for the conveyancer's fees. If it's a private seller, it's exactly the same, but you probably have a bit more leeway to negotiate with them on that, whether it is to get a discount, or whether it is that you want to appoint your own conveyancer, or whether it is that you ask them to pay half of the fees or maybe all of the fees. So I think your negotiation is just going to be much easier, because you've actually got a face to your seller. But if you've got a developer, there's no face to it. It's basically your piece of paper, and it's this massive developer that you actually don't have someone to speak to.
Esri, I mean, I'd certainly be interested to see who's able to negotiate the full fee being waived, because I know even the banks typically don't absorb it. Some of the home loans, they take a certain amount. They sometimes don't necessarily take the full amount. And there, I think it's also just one of those things that when you are on the property market, there are certain costs that you're going to have to budget for, and this is one of those costs. If you're lucky to get a discount when working with a particular conveyancer, that's fantastic. If you're lucky that your bank allows that cost to be absorbed into your home loan, that's even better. Although I would probably urge you to perhaps not do that. because when you actually look at, the difference, let's suppose, for example, your full, let's say the conveyancing fee is going to be, let's say, 20,000 for argument's sake. When you actually look at the difference that 20,000 does over a 20-year period, because you're essentially putting that into a 20-year period with all that interest, it's actually not in your best interest to probably have it absorbed into your home loan. And there are really great calculators that you can use right here on private property. You can go into our website on privateproperty.co.za and play around with some of the calculators. The calculator that you want to play around with is the one that tells you how much you're going to be paying when it comes to transfer costs. And then once you get that figure, take that and play around with the calculator of how much you're going to be paying for your full term over the 20-year period. Of course, assuming the interest rates are going to stay the same. We know they are not, but it gives you a great sense of what the difference of not including the conveyancing amount and including it, and just how much interest you're probably going to rake up. So as much as possible, probably don't want to do that, especially on your primary residence. I think one of the big things with the primary residence, you can't get money out of it. You can't extract money from it. You're not going to get SARS to pay you back. Whereas with your investment properties, there are great ways that SARS can pay you back. You can claim back when you look at the interest that you pay on your home loan. So maybe your trick would be to put it in your home loan, because then the interest is going to be higher. So I think play around with the calculators, play around with the numbers. Don't make sure that you're not setting up yourself to pay more, especially in interest over the 20-year period, as much as possible. Because we all want to, save a little bit when we look at our home loan journey. It is very likely going to be one of the longest relationships we're going to very likely find ourselves in. So you want to make sure that you are spending as little as you possibly can on it. Now, Esri, before I let you go, any other final tips for viewers at home who are very likely looking at new developments right now? We're seeing quite a lot of bullish building, especially in the Gauteng region. And I know that a lot of viewers at home also tune into the developers show over the weekend. So there are already certain developments that they probably have their eyes on. Any tips that you'd like to share with them when it comes to especially dealing with, the legal aspect of their transaction as they buy their property?
Yes, I think there's one thing that in my experience has now stood out for me with all the developments that I've been involved in, and that is that there's usually a clause, if you've got a good conveyancer drafting the sale agreements, there's usually a clause in the sale agreement where it says that if the development is not ready for beneficial occupation, or your unit is not ready for beneficial occupation within 12 months or 24 months of your beneficial occupation date that they give you in the sale agreement, then you can automatically cancel and you can get your money back. And I think that a lot of purchasers are so excited to buy into this development, and then COVID happens, or then, the builders are useless and the developer needs to fire the builders, and then
they go on strike, or the construction work, or they go under liquidation. I've seen property, construction where the construction company ends up, that's been subcontracted, goes into liquidation, and it halts construction altogether, because unfortunately not every developer owns their full value chain. They have to subcontract some of certain aspects of the development. So if they go into liquidation, then it halts construction altogether.
No, it's a massive problem, and so I would suggest that you first of all read your sale agreement 100%. I know that it is a very long document, and it is probably 80 pages, but it's worth it. It's worth it. And my second word of advice would be go and see your own conveyancer before you sign that sale agreement, because those clauses are probably the most important clauses. But other than that, there are a million other things that you need to take into account. And I'd suggest that you just go see an attorney or a conveyancer or a commercial attorney before you sign.
Well, Esri, we're going to leave it there this evening. Very big one. Read that sale agreement. I know even just a normal offer to purchase, it can feel like it's such a long document and you just want to, initial and sign at the end. but you want to make sure that you understand each and every single line. When you don't understand, ask them. It's their job to answer, the questions. So never feel like, oh my God, I've already asked them 10 questions. I now feel a little bad in terms of asking another one. Don't feel bad at all. Make sure that you ask them as much as possible. We've got a last question that I'm going to squeeze in here, only because it's coming from one of our regulars, Ushakong Shakong, who asks, what options does one have to pay a deposit when buying an off-plan development for which occupation isn't 12 months or so away? I paid for such, but with my interest rate that my money will earn in the attorney's trust account, I will probably have earned a whole R5 in interest by December 2021.
Yeah, it's a very sad state of affairs, because unfortunately you are stuck with, obviously it depends on what your sale agreement says, but most of the times you're stuck with the banks that the conveyancer banks with. So if it is only Investec, you're limited to only Investec and to only the percentage that Investec will give you in your interest-bearing account. Usually the sale agreements only makes provision for the deposit to be placed in the interest-bearing account for the purchaser's benefit, and that's it. There's nothing else. It doesn't say that it needs to be at 5%. It doesn't say 10%. It doesn't say anything else. So unfortunately, that is the case. Again, if you read your sale agreement, that's the question. I would again suggest that you ask the conveyancer beforehand. Where is it going into? What is the percentage that you can give me? And then decide. And then maybe perhaps you can always say that I want to pay the deposit later, if your sale agreement hasn't been signed yet. Because it's a bone of contention for a lot of purchasers, but unfortunately, that is what it is.
Yeah. Well, Esri, we're going to leave it there this evening. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It was lovely.
And that's Esri Marais, who's the partner at Marais Pacitti Attorneys. We're certainly going to be having her back again here on the Private Property Podcast. It's always a pleasure to have her on the show. And I do hope to our viewers at home that you have a better understanding of the role that conveyancers play when it comes to developments. I know a lot of us are probably, viewing different developments right now, and probably didn't even have an understanding of some of the things that happened behind the scenes, or before we see that big placard that say, phase 1 is now selling. And as you keep seeing the percentages in terms of how much is being sold going up, there's so many people behind the scenes making sure that that happens. Well, we're going to leave it there this evening here on the Private Property Podcast. It has been a pleasure for me, Zama, and the rest of the team. We're going to be back again on your screens tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. But before we come, of course, you're going to be listening and watching Umbali on your screens at 1 o'clock on the Farming Podcast. That's something to look forward to for all the farming enthusiasts, or certain people who are looking to maybe try your hand at something agriculture. Do make sure that you tune in to the Farming Podcast tomorrow at 1 p.m. Well, until tomorrow at 7 p.m., I'll be back on your screens, hoping as usual that you're staying home and staying safe.
Hi, I'm Clifton Smithers. I live in Belito, where my partners and I run a business called Union 3. As a family, we chose to move here about 6 years ago. What attracted us to the area was the safe and relaxed lifestyle of the North Coast. We're surrounded by so much natural beauty, and we love that it's so casual. It's just not as intense as a busy city. In fact, that's one of the main reasons there's so many people moving into the area. There's some amazing lifestyle estates out here. We've got Zimbali, Brettonwood Estate, and Zimbiti, to name a few. The Belito Lifestyle Centre caters to everyone's needs. There's also some smaller commercial centres like Tiffany's and Salt Rock. There's some excellent restaurants to choose from, and there's a really wide variety of activities on offer. From mountain biking out on the trails to surfing at any one of the beaches, there really is something for everyone. This quiet little town really comes alive over the weekend. The live concerts in the farmers market at the Lychee Orchard is very popular. With the new international airport just 15 minutes down the road and the unmatched lifestyle that this place offers, it's no wonder that the North Coast is the fastest growing town in South Africa. My family and I absolutely love it here, and this is our neighborhood.